Growing up, I watched a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh anime. Now, weirdly enough, I never actually saw all of it until I was already like in high school and then college. I also watched a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh Abridged, which I think heavily influences my experience of Yu-Gi-Oh to a certain extent. One of the things that I've found very interesting over the years is sort of dissecting what exactly went into creating Yu-Gi-Oh as a concept and looking at not just the card game, which is kind of where my interests lie primarily, but also looking at the anime and how the anime influenced the card game and the card game influenced the anime. And it's interesting to know that pretty much from the beginning, there wasn't really any card game being conceived. If you go back and you look at some of the earliest incarnations of Yu-Gi-Oh, the original Yu-Gi-Oh manga featured more than just the card game. In fact, the card game was sort of like a passing thing in the beginning. Like it was something that people thought about and people, referenced within the universe, but it was actually mostly meant to be like a parody of Magic the Gathering, going so far as calling it Magic and Wizards. Very, very original name. But eventually, as more chapters of the manga came out, fans that wrote in were far more interested in seeing more of the card game than any other game because it's in its original, because originally it was conceived as a manga that followed a kid who got heavily bullied in school, and he discovers this ancient Egyptian artifact, and this artifact basically allows him to turn into an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. And this pharaoh is extremely good at games, like unnaturally good at games. And not just one specific game, but just games in general. In fact, the name Yu-Gi-Oh derives from a Japanese phrase which means king of games, which is why in the series proper you hear Yugi and Yami being referred to as the king of games, and why that phrase comes up so often. Now, originally he was just meant to play a bunch of different games. In fact, there was a rotating cast of sort of antagonists that would show up sort of, episodically over the course of the series, and they would, stir up trouble, cause problems maybe for, some of Yugi's friends or just, people in general in the city. And Yugi's alter ego would take over and then force these bad people to play some game that is sort of ironically related to whatever it is that the person was doing that was bad. And so you get in scenarios where Yami Yugi just mutilates and murders people. Like, Kaiba's character in the original run gets paralyzed in their game and has to go around in a wheelchair for the remainder of the series. Now, one of the games that comes up is a card game, as I mentioned, and fans were so enamored with this card game that they wanted to see more. So Kazuki Takahashi started introducing it more into the story. Nose itches. As he introduced it more into the story, they started seeing potential for this to kind of like be the main focus of the series. So Kazuki Takahashi decided, in conjunction with his publishers and his editors and the powers that be, they decided to start focusing more on the card game. Eventually, they just straight up abandoned the idea of having any other game other than the card game. But what's funny is over the course of the series, you actually see other games creep in. I believe I can think of 3 examples from the original run of Yu-Gi-Oh! That focuses exclusively on the card game, where they actually try to introduce other games. So, the first has to do with Yu-Gi-Oh in the same way that the other two do, but it's interesting in the sense that I believe this is the only one that ever received a full endorsement and actually got product printed to support it, and that was Dungeon Dice Monsters. Now, there's a board game you can pick up to play Dungeon Dice Monsters, and there's a video game, both of which are very expensive to buy if you want to get a copy. And it's kind of a shame. I'd really love to see them revisit that concept, even if they just do like an anniversary printing of the original Dungeon Dice Monsters like board game and don't make any changes to it. Just have there be a newer version so that people that grew up with it and want to purchase a copy for themselves don't have to drop a bunch of money on an old version of it on eBay. Now, this game was a tabletop game that was much more akin to like a board game because you would roll dice and then the dice would unfold into sort of board pieces that allowed your monsters to sort of move around the board. Now, cards were printed that featured, the monsters, the stats, any like special effects that they might have had. So it was very similar to Yu-Gi-Oh in that sense, but instead of having, the monster zones, the spell and trap zones, you had a board and you would roll for movement, you would roll for effects. You would also be able to like attack things if you got close to them on the board. So it was closer to like a turn-based real-time strategy type of game. And it was not very popular when it was originally released. Nowadays, people who are into Yu-Gi-Oh and grew up on Yu-Gi-Oh remember this and want to play it. There's people that I know in real life that would kill to have a copy of this board game, which is crazy because I remember getting one for Christmas one year and playing it at my grandparents' house with my cousins. I don't remember if it was mine, if it was with my cousins, I don't know. And I have no clue where that copy of the board game ended up at this point. But if I can get my hands on it, oh boy, you bet I'm going to make a video about it. But that's neither here nor there. The big draw was the fact that it allowed you to play with the Yu-Gi-Oh monsters, but you had a different way of playing. Now, it borrowed a lot of mechanics from Yu-Gi-Oh. You have attacking the opponent directly. You have to move across the board to do it. But if you're able to build a bridge all the way to your opponent, you can attack their heart points. Totally different from life points, by the way. It's closer to like lives because I believe you get 3 heart points and 3 direct attacks will cause you to lose the game. And it was interesting. It was a cool concept that never really saw very much fleshing out because it just wasn't as popular as I think Konami wanted it to be. Now, the second game I want to talk about is Capsule Monsters, which is funny because Capsule Monsters was basically a nothing of a game, right? It was sort of an attempt to, I guess, do something similar to what Bakugan was trying to do, but there were no physical products released that featured the game. They never made it into a video game. And as far as I can tell, it was not something that Kazuki Takahashi came up with himself. So it's pretty safe to say that that one just kind of fizzled out because it was mostly just there to kind of fill time as they were waiting for the manga to catch up to them, since they were creating an anime based on the manga. If the manga, goes too far or spends too long on a certain point, or you catch up to the manga too quickly in your adaptation, you need to fill time so that you can wait for more chapters to come out to forward the plot. It's a pretty common thing in anime, for those of you that aren't aware, all 2 of you that play Yu-Gi-Oh! And aren't also familiar with anime. Now, the last game I want to talk about requires a little bit more build-up, I think. So, one of the things that Takahashi was a huge fan of was tabletop RPGs. You can kind of see that with Dungeon Dice Monsters, although it's not really that much of an RPG as it is more of just like a straightforward board game. You can kind of role play if you want, but the point of a tabletop RPG is to sort of have very loose rulings and just sort of kind of play with your imagination, so to speak. And you can tell that Takahashi really missed the days of just being able to sort of write about whatever game he wanted. And as Yu-Gi-Oh! The original run, the Duel Monsters arc, as it was later come to be called, as that started winding down, I think Takahashi started seeing the opportunity to start exploring more concepts. Because the final arc of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters is sort of all over the place. There is a tournament, but unlike previous arcs that featured a tournament, the tournament is not the focus of the arc. The focus of the arc is the Pharaoh regaining his memories. And he does not do that over the course of the tournament. The tournament plays out, and then they leave the tournament and go to ancient Egypt. All of the characters just transport to ancient Egypt. And in doing so, they do play a few games of Yu-Gi-Oh! Kind of loosely, I guess you can call it that. But it's revealed that the entirety of their adventure through ancient Egypt is actually part of a tabletop RPG being played out between Yami Yugi and Yami Bakura. And it's referred to as the Dark RPG. It's basically the final shadow game of the original run of Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, you could argue that the climax of the series is the final duel between Yami and Yugi. But I think the part that Takahashi was most excited to bring to life was the Dark RPG, because so much of sort of the role playing style of gameplay really comes into play in that final arc. You get a story being told, you get characters participating in the story, and you get narrators on the outside being able to sort of somewhat dictate what's going on. But in this case, the game that's being played is actually a reenactment of real world events from the time of Pharaoh's actual time as a pharaoh. And some of the things that get revealed are interesting because over the course of the entire series, they've built up this idea that tons of the characters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are ancestors of people that existed in ancient Egypt when Yami was pharaoh. And, Kaiba's there, Bakura's there, and you have these situations where the actual present day characters get to meet with their ancestors in ancient Egypt, and Kaiba especially has to deal with sort of his own skepticism with the whole situation, and he gets to sort of participate in this dark RPG as, like, I don't know if you'd call him a player or an NPC, but he definitely has a role. Arguably they're even just spectators, but they are in the mix as things are going on. And you can really tell all of the love and care that Takahashi puts into that final tabletop game. With the introduction of Zark and, the gods coming into play, the stories being told, the reveals being made. And it's cool to see all of this unfold in front of you. And, it's a difficult thing to adapt into a physical game because it's based on something that doesn't really have a physical analog anyway. You could maybe make like a D&D campaign to go along with it, make like a companion piece to allow people to sort of play through it in like a D&D setting. But D&D is its own trademark, and creating product that sort of facilitates people to like use their imagination or rely on another person to tell them what's happening in the game is a really difficult thing to sell. So I can understand why it never saw any sort of like physical release. I can see a lot of people either at the time or, later on as they became older and sort of revisited Yu-Gi-Oh in adulthood, creating their own campaigns based on such a thing. And it's cool. It's cool to see that Takahashi was able to sort of incorporate his love for gaming in general into a show and a manga and a series and a franchise that basically built its entire identity around exclusively the card game. And all of that sort of ties into the way that the card game is going now, because a lot of archetypes and a lot of decks nowadays really like to push the envelope on what's possible to do in a game of Yu-Gi-Oh. You have sort of decks like Cardian, which force you to basically play a completely different game inside the game of Yu-Gi-Oh. You have decks like the old Archfiend deck, which tries to base its gameplay around chess. You have the new Valance cards, which also try to sort of mimic some of those board games / tabletop games that you could play in their mechanics and their gameplay. And it's fun to see these things explored. And, rest in peace, Kazuki Takahashi. I think, you know, if he were around to sort of give his take on what's happening, I think he'd enjoy it a lot because his his allegiance never lied exclusively in the card game. It's very clear that he loved all kinds of games. And to see the card game evolve in such a way that it sort of incorporates other game mechanics into itself in a way that sort of breaks its own rules while still adhering to the core gameplay mechanics, that's really interesting. And I think it serves as a very cool sort of throwback to the origins of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a manga and as a series. If you found this video even remotely interesting, go ahead and hit subscribe so you can see more videos. I have something big coming down the pipeline. I'm hoping that I can find the time to record it. We'll have to see. I may even create a trailer. I want to get the whole series recorded and done before I start uploading anything from it, so it may be a while before anything happens. But in the meantime, hit that subscribe so you can know when things are coming out, and I'll see you guys in the next one.